Hello, my name is Jim Hadley, and at the beginning of each of these 10-part programs, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an idea about the point of view from which I approach the subject matter. Museums like this display what are called, in the most general sense, works of art. But what gives a work of art its value? Why do we put it in a place like this? If you're familiar with the typical art history text, you've been led to believe that what's most important, what's most valuable about a work of art is what it looks like. Art historians try to convince us of this by talking above all else about things like dramatic intersecting diagonals, monumental groupings, lines, forms, and so on. Sometimes this kind of language can be pretty far from useful, however. Take this example from Bruce Cole and Adelheid Galt's book, Art of the Western World. Rationality and irrationality are woven together as line defines volume here and denies its existence there, as gold implies space in one spot and affirms a flat surface in another. Irreconcilable differences somehow coexist here. Would you say that this description fits this picture? Sounds like it could to me, but in fact, it's a description of this 14th century enunciation by Simone Martini. Maybe this is a little unfair of me, but only a little. I can just imagine Bruce Cole or, say, Kenneth Baker trying to describe a man who'd robbed him to the police. They'd never catch the guy. But the real point I want to make isn't that the language of art historians is often more likely to produce puzzlement or laughter than insight. The point I want to make is rather simply just that this kind of language leads us to concentrate on appearances. This is a problem because when art historians leave their books, as it were, and come out in the real world, it sometimes seems as though what a work of art looks like counts for almost nothing at all. For example, the New York Metropolitan Museum used to have what was supposed to be an ancient Egyptian bronze cat on display. It was one of the most popular items in the museum until it was discovered to be a forgery and immediately removed. Not because of anything connected with its appearance, but because it was made using a technique unknown to ancient Egyptian artists. The Rembrandt Research Committee is currently providing many relevant examples of this sort of thing. These fellows are trying to establish which alleged Rembrandts are actual Rembrandts. The Berlin Museum's Man with a Golden Helmet here is one of the relatively few well-known pictures formerly attributed to Rembrandt to be reattributed by them, and it is one of the relatively few quantum Rembrandts, whether well-known or not, still on display, although it too has been demoted from what Steve Martin calls Rembrandt wow to Rembrandt yeah right. Of the 12 alleged Rembrandts, for example, that the RRC says are not Rembrandts in the Washington National Gallery, only one is still on display at all, yet not one looks any different than it did before the RRC's investigations. We didn't see any headlines that read, say, Rembrandt found with diagonals that no longer intersect. Copies of Dürer engravings, indistinguishable from the original to the naked eye, are available to anyone with a nickel for a Xerox machine, while the originals are valued as great works of art. How can this be explained if the appearance of a work of art is the main thing that makes it valuable to us? What these kinds of cases illustrate is that there is a radical inconsistency in the way art historians do business. What is valuable about a work of art is obviously something much more complex than just what it looks like. We don't have time to go into this in a lot of detail here, but I think the most important factor determining the value of works of art, at least of the sort that get into art history texts, is what we might call their evocative power. Consider this case. Suppose you have a picture on your desk which you think is a portrait of you drawn by your daughter when she was 6. And then one day your now grown daughter comes in and says, Dad, I have a confession to make. You know that picture on your desk that you think is a portrait of you by me at the age of 6? Well, Dad, I didn't draw that. Remember little Betty Kowalski down the street? She drew it, and it's not you at all, Dad. It's supposed to be Paul McCartney. You might still keep the picture around, put it in the bottom drawer of your desk, sort of your equivalent to the depot where the Washington National Gallery stores its pseudo-Rembrandts, but your attitude to it has changed entirely. Not because anything about its appearance has changed, but because its evocative power has changed. Now, to an art historian, Rembrandt is practically like a member of his own family, and when something thought to represent him is found to be false, this changes his whole attitude to the work, regardless of the fact it still looks the same. But for the evocative power of works of art to affect us, for them to serve as the exalted souvenirs of the whole cultural context out of which they come, we have to be familiar with those contexts. We need to know about their subjects, the subjects of the works of art, and about religion, politics, the other arts like literature and music, the whole cultural package, if works of art are going to be anything more than collections of dramatic intersecting diagonals and monumental groupings, lines defining volume and colors implying space in one spot and a flat surface in another. This way of approaching the history of art tends to blur the distinction between works of art and historical artifacts, as they might be called, between things like, say, the Mona Lisa and things like, to take an extreme case, Napoleon's toothbrush on display in the Carnavalet Museum in Paris. And different as the interest we take in the one may seem from the interest we take in the other, in this pair of extreme examples, their value to us comes ultimately from a common source, their evocative power. In fact, almost anything old enough or evocative enough comes to be treated like a work of art, whether it was meant to be one or not. In the end, and I think this is an important point, history itself comes to take on much the quality of a work of art, in which we judge events not so much by moral standards, but by whether or not they are interesting or enlightening or moving. A sort of corollary to this is that something that didn't happen, like the Trojan War, can have much more importance than lots of things that really did happen, and Odysseus and Hamlet can be as important as Henry VIII and Napoleon. This may also seem like a rather extreme position at this point, but I think what I mean will eventually be both clear and persuasive if you stick with these lectures long enough. The general purpose of the lectures, then, is just to tell enough of the story of the Euro-Mediterranean chapter of this whole unfaded and substantial pageant that is sometimes called the history of civilization, to allow us to increase our appreciation of the value of the souvenirs of it that we have, whether they are works of art, music, literature, battlefields, buildings, tombs, or toothbrushes. Eh bien, mes amis, à l'affaire. Now, since we're going to be spending around 18 hours in the series of programs this quarter, I'd like to start by just giving you a bit of an overview of what we'll be covering, a sort of preview of coming attractions. The lecture series this quarter will essentially concentrate on the period from around 300 to 1300 AD, but we're going to actually be starting a little further back than 300 in this first lecture, back about 100 in fact. This picture of Trajan's column in Rome may seem like an odd one to use to represent even the earliest part of a lecture series that's supposed to be about the Middle Ages, but there is a defensible appropriateness about it. A statue of St. Peter's on top of it now, and that suggests the way in which the Christianity of the Middle Ages attempted to take over and make acceptable the best of pagan classicism. The Renaissance is popularly considered to mark the rebirth of an interest in classicism, but this, in fact, is an interest that never died out, and one of the recurring themes of these lectures will be this important fact. Trajan himself is said to have been led into paradise on the intercession of Gregory the Great, which is just another example of this sort of thing. In 312, the Emperor Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and definitively legalized Christianity, an event with which one could say the Middle Ages really began. None of the churches of Constantine's day survive in Rome, but the following century produced several that are still largely as they were 1600 years ago. Santa Maria Maggiore here is one we'll visit, and its mosaics contain the earliest surviving works of art to illustrate several important biblical events, including the Annunciation. 476 is the official date accepted for the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and according to many, the beginning of the Middle Ages. As we'll see, that's just one date among many which could be picked, but in any case, the Eastern Empire lasted much longer, until 1453 in fact, and here you see one of its most splendid accomplishments, most splendid works of architecture, the 6th century Church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which we'll visit, and which, according to Henry Adams and Kenneth Clark, houses one of the 2 greatest covered spaces in the world, but which, according to Richard Krautheimer, also defies all the laws of statics and stands only by a miracle. The Middle Ages produced a lot of interesting literature, though most of what was written before 1100 is now read only by scholars. The heroes, at least, of many works of later medieval literature are, however, well enough known. Fellows like Roland, El Cid, and of course King Arthur, who is traditionally supposed to have been buried here at Glastonbury. To try to please everybody, I'll try to prove both that he didn't and that he did exist. But the fact that England's first major historian, the Venerable Bede, doesn't even mention him, makes the latter pretty difficult. This is a page from the Lindisfarne Gospel, made in England in the 8th century. It's interesting that the first half of the Middle Ages, which produces so little enduring literature, is nevertheless the era which produced what are probably the most beautiful books ever made. Few could read, few could write, but one could argue that the most important painting and sculpture of the period decorates these books, and that no era in the history of civilization ever respected the written word more. There are a lot of battles fought in the Middle Ages, of course, and one date in European history everyone likely to be watching this program knows is the date of a battle, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And it was fought here, where Battle Abbey is now. There are lots of political and social and economic reasons and so on given for why battles are fought, wars are fought. But the bottom line is, I think, that men like to fight. Some would have you believe that if we just got rid of TV, all would be peace and sweetness. But Attila and the Huns didn't watch much TV, and William the Conqueror didn't play video games. The Battle of Hastings is, of course, the subject of a famous, if not a beautiful, work of art, the Bayeux Tapestry, which is by far the oldest large-scale work of fabric art in existence, but which Gainsborough, in fact, called the ugliest thing in the whole history of art. However, a thing doesn't have to be beautiful to be a work of art, and we'll see a lot of things this quarter which it won't be easy to call beautiful, but which are very interesting and evocative nevertheless. Christianity was the main cultural influence on Western civilization in the Middle Ages, but it was not without a challenge, as we'll see. In 711, the Arab-led invasion of Spain began, and for hundreds of years, large parts of Spain were to be under Muslim control. Some think, in fact, that the accomplishments of Islamic Spain, like the Alhambra here, are among the real high points of the Middle Ages in Europe. From the 11th century on, there was a sort of crusade going to drive Islam out of Spain, and at the other end of the Mediterranean there was a similar Christian-Muslim conflict. The most successful of the crusades in the East, as we'll see, was the first one, but the most famous was the third, led by Richard the Lionhearted, of whom you see a modern statue here. As Churchill said, this may not be what he looked like, but it's what he ought to have looked like. He was, though very brave and a powerful leader, not without flaws. He was, for example, an amateur musician. In fact, a very talented one, however, and we'll hear a song he wrote. He was a sort of troubadour, and the songs of the troubadours are the earliest surviving examples of popular music we can really hear. We'll also hear a lot of music written for the church, some of which survives from very early in its history. This is called the Age of Castles and Cathedrals, and we'll see a lot of castles, but it's the churches which get into the art history books. After a 500-year dark age, from which we have only a handful of buildings surviving from the whole of Northern Europe, beginning in the 11th century, There was an explosion of Christian activity and building that is the major feature of what is often called the High Middle Ages. It began with the Romanesque style, represented by buildings like San Martin de Canigou here in the Pyrenees. Large-scale sculpture, which is also almost entirely absent from Europe, between 500 and 1000, reappeared with this style on the facades of 12th century churches like the Cathedral of Autun here. And by 1200, all the elements of the Gothic style were coming together in such unsurpassed architectural accomplishments as the Cathedral of Chartres, which you see now. These elements included the ribbed groin vault, pointed arches, flying buttresses. But Abbot Suger, who was the architect of Saint-Denis outside Paris, said it was the stained glass and the character of the interior atmosphere it created in the churches that was the key feature of the Gothic style. And Henry Adams calls stained glass the most splendid color decoration the world has ever seen. Okay, then, those are just a few of the things you can look forward to seeing this quarter, and now we'll get started on page 1. To glance back rather than forward now for just a minute or two, you'll remember if you attended the lectures last quarter that the Roman Republic really ended with the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, but the empire which succeeded it is usually said to have begun with the gift by the Senate to Octavius of the title Augustus in 27 BC. He also kept his military title, Imperator, and though Augustus maintained the fiction that Rome was still a republic in the old sense, it became with his reign for all practical purposes a military dictatorship. The story goes that Abraham Lincoln once made a proposal to his cabinet, and when all 8 members, or however many there were, opposed it, he announced the results thusly: Nays 8, ayes 1, the ayes have it. Augustus stood to the old Roman Republican agencies like Lincoln stood to his cabinet. They could talk and argue, they could advise, but he could do as he pleased because he commanded 30 legions. Last quarter we heard about his successors, the Julio-Claudians, who ruled Rome until the assassination of Nero in 68, which, after a year or so of confusion, brought the Flavian dynasty to power. And this dynasty, which included Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, then ruled Rome until 96 AD. And as we saw again last quarter, this dynasty was responsible for the building which is the very symbol of Rome to most people, the Flavian Amphitheater or Colosseum. In this picture, you're looking back across what was the heart of Roman antiquity, with the Forum beyond the Colosseum and St. Peter's in the distance. Vespasian, as we saw, was succeeded by his son Titus, who built the arch at the east end of the Forum. The historian Dio Cassius says that when Titus fell ill, Domitian claimed that the cure he needed was to be packed in ice. This was so ordered, and he promptly died of pneumonia to the delight of his wicked brother. And here's Domitian now, and with his reign we really break new ground, even for those of you who were here last quarter. Rome produced many prolific sculptors, certainly, but their work as a whole is not considered up to the standards of the Greeks, though I admit it's hardly fair to generalize so widely. They are also essentially an anonymous bunch, which contributes, I think, to the general view that Roman sculpture was sort of mass-produced in factories. The Romans are often, however, said to have done their best work in portraiture, so this and the other busts we're going to see are probably good likenesses. Domitian here is not an appealing character. The satirist Juvenal says that to talk to him even about the weather was to risk your life, and Suetonius says his hobby was catching flies and pulling the wings off of them. Probably the best thing he did was die and leave no son, which gave the Senate an opportunity to briefly reassert its old influence and choose a successor from its membership. And the man chosen was Nerva, a well-regarded poet and lawyer in his 60s. This is Nerva now, who is not well known, but Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, says that the happiest century in human history began with his reign. Essentially, this is the 2nd century AD, the century of the good emperors, as it is sometimes known, from the accession of Nerva in 96 to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180. One of the things that contributed to the quality of this century is the fact that Nerva and his next 3 successors all died without sons to raise and spoil. Each followed the precedent Nerva set by adopting a fellow, to put the most sanguine spin on it now, he considered best qualified to rule, and they all made good choices. Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall in the 18th century. It was published in 1776, so he didn't live to enjoy our own happy century, but I'm not sure he would have changed his mind anyway. The man Nerva adopted was Trajan, whom you see here, and who was the most powerful man in the army and would likely have taken over anyway. It was in Trajan's day that the city of Rome probably reached its greatest population in antiquity, about 1,200,000, and it was in his day that the geographic extent of the empire was also at its greatest. From Britain to North Africa, from the Atlantic to the Tigris, everything was Rome. In this lecture, we'll focus more on the city, and next time, more on the empire at large. In this picture, you're looking down on the Capitoline Hill in the foreground, with the Forum beyond leading to the Colosseum in the distance. In antiquity, the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus was where the conservatory, the Palazzo dei Conservatori Museum is now at the lower right, and the Temple of Jupiter's consort Juno was at the lower left, where the Church of Santa Maria Araceli is now. Juno's temple housed the mint, so it was called Juno Moneta. In the Museo della Civiltà Romana, you can see the giant model of Rome as it looked about 300 AD, made by the architect Italo Gismondi back in the middle of the 20th century. In this view, you're looking in the opposite direction from that of the previous picture, and you can see what the temples of Jupiter and Juno probably looked something like. Here they are up closer. It was in the Temple of Juno Moneta that Augustus is said to have been granted a revelation to the effect that the Savior of mankind would be born in his reign. This was a kind of annunciation, and this kind of tradition was one of those things that made it easier for the church to absorb classicism to the extent that it did. Inside the church that now stands where the Temple of Juno was, you can see the Sibyl, which Sibyl depends on which source you consult, on the left and Augustus on the right. This commemorates his reception of the news that the Savior would be born in his reign. And this subject occurs many times in Christian church decoration, though none of the sources are even close to being contemporary with the supposed event. Now you're looking the other way, back to the east and down into the Forum. At the lower center is the Basilica of Julius Caesar, the Basilica Julia, and just above its upper left corner is the Temple of Julius Caesar, both of which we heard about last quarter. We'll get better looks at what the Senate, the Basilica Aemilia, and the Vestal Precinct are like today shortly, but you should also notice the Temple of the Dioscuri. 3 columns of this temple remained standing all through the Middle Ages and were one of the landmarks of Rome, along with the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, about which we'll hear more next week, which was turned into a church and thereby preserved. Back toward the Colosseum in the distance are 2 giant buildings we'll also hear about in the future, the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine and the Temple of Venus in Roma. As I mentioned last quarter too, there's very little of Republican Rome still to be seen. Almost all the things that survive to represent Roman antiquity are imperial and from the first 5 centuries of the Christian era. In the 18th century, the Italian engraver Piranesi made this view of the Forum looking east, and by this time the Forum of Trajan's day was under about 20 feet of rubble. About the only recognizable things in this picture are those columns of the Temple of the Dioscuri, which I mentioned at the far right, and the Temple of Antoninus and his wife Faustina at the left. The big arch at the lower left is that of Septimius Severus, whom we'll hear about next week. Rodolfo Lanciani and his excavators in the 19th century removed something like 400,000 cubic yards of rubble to take the floor of the Forum back down to the imperial level. Now you see the Forum as it looks today. At the left still is the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, with the three columns of the Dioscuri to the right. The Dioscuri, that means the two boys in Greek, were Castor and Pollux, who were considered to have helped the Romans win a crucial battle and were then honored with this temple. Here you can see the columns up closer. They're Corinthian columns, the capitals of which are made from stylized acanthus leaves, and you see an acanthus there just below. Of the three architectural styles developed by the Greeks, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, the Romans took over the last, and as a rule of thumb, any building, even in Greece, which has Corinthian columns, was built by the Romans. Beside the temple is the spring where the Dioscuri are supposed to have watered their horses after the battle, and this, the so-called Lacus Juturnae, is one of the spots in the Forum where you can see the water that is still down there. When the city of Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, this was all a swamp. On the left side of the altar in this picture, you can see Leda and Zeus in his swan disguise. They were the parents of Castor and Pollux, and that explains their presence here. And also, according to some mythographers, they were likewise the parents of Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra. This is apparently, again, the original altar, which was on display for a time at least in the small museum in the so-called Temple of Romulus, however. This is the precinct of the Vestal Virgins now. Native Roman religion was not really very spiritual as we use that word today. Being religious for an ancient Roman of the Republic was not typically much different than being patriotic. It amounted to a large extent to honoring the gods and traditions of the state on the proper occasions in the proper ways. By the beginning of the empire, however, various religions of non-Roman origin were becoming more popular, as we'll see next week. Stoicism, though it's usually said to be a philosophy rather than a religion, and which was Greek in origin, became something like an imperial cult in the 2nd century AD. Also by that time, the worship of Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, and Jesus of Galilee had become popular. In part, at least because they promised life after death. Rome is sometimes regarded as sort of the Southern California of its day, a kind of spiritual vacuum into which foreign religions were pulled. The Vestals were something like the custodians of the native religious traditions. They were present at festivals to perform ceremonies and had other important sacred business to deal with as well. This is a statue of a nameless but obviously much respected 4th century Vestal. The Vestals were chosen by the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder, and even the Romans had forgotten why he was called that. It must have had some metaphorical meaning originally, presumably. Anyway, it's also the origin of our word pontiff, applied to the Pope. The girls chosen for the honor of admission to the Vestals were between the ages of 6 and 10 and were committed to serve for 30 years. This was considered a great honor for the families of the girls, but 30 years of your life is a lot to give up, even for the honor of your family. This is the restored Temple of Vesta, the Roman equivalent to the Greek Hestia, the guardian of hearth and home. One of the most important things the Vestals had to do was maintain what was regarded as the sacred hearth fire of Rome itself. This function probably went back to a time when it was necessary to maintain a community fire so that those whose own home fires went out could come and get brands with which to restart them. By the 2nd century AD, however, the Romans had all kinds of ways to make fire. They even had matches of a sort. But the symbolic importance of the communal hearth fire was still taken very seriously. The Palladium, the statue of Athena, said to have been brought from Troy by Aeneas, regarded as the founder of Roman civilization, was also kept here and had to be looked after in a time-honored ritual. In this picture, you can get an idea of just how extensively restored this temple is. The small pieces, like the one marked by the arrow, are the parts of the ancient temple that were just set into the modern concrete matrix by the restorers. The institution of the Vestals itself lasted well beyond the legalization of Christianity, and the place wasn't closed until 394 AD. Never blows the rose so red as where some buried Caesar bled, says the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Well, that's where we'll take the break, and in that second half we'll hear about Trajan and the early Christians, among other things.